confessing that it's a real pleasure for me to contribute to this refresher series, not only because its theme, that is social and cultural change in India, is extremely interesting for me, but also because I value the growth of online learning materials to which the teaching learning center of Ramanujan College is also contributing. And I really heartily congratulate the history department and the TLC at Ramanujan College for this uh, arrangement. Now, the topic of my talk is society and culture in a North Indian village, approximately 1780 to 2020, accessing commoners' histories through fieldwork. The village that I'm going to talk about is called Dhantala and is located in Meerut district of Western Uttar Pradesh. What do I mean by social and cultural change in the village? Actually, the terms social and cultural change have not only been used in diverse ways by scholars, but also there are many overlaps between these categories. For example, sometimes we study patriarchy as part of culture and sometimes as part of social structure. Similarly, daily life, education, there is an element of imprecision about such usages. So I'll begin by first clarifying what exactly I mean by social structure and by culture. By the former, I am referring to the varieties of groupings in a society, both emic or those which are familiar to the subjects studied by us, and also etic groupings which are based on some shared attribute considered important from the researcher's perspective. The former, for example, would include caste, gotra, and the latter would include class, subaltern, etc. So the study of such social structure would include the study of relations between these various groupings and also the long-term mapping of changes in such structures. Similarly, by the term culture, I'm especially referring to the subtle realm of shared mentalities or widely held beliefs, values, loyalties, emotion patterns in communities, which are undoubtedly very difficult to map, especially at the community level, but they can be broadly gauged, especially by contrasting various regions and nationalities, etc. For example, the moment we discuss the marital relations between Germans and North Indians, the contrasts stand out very clearly. So, in comparative light, these cultural differences can be gauged. And this is what I see as the core of culture. But these shared mentalities and also behavior patterns, shared behavior patterns in a community, like how people eat, what time do they sleep, what kind of apparel they wear, what does it signify about their values, etc. These are all shaped by a number of cultural institutions in conjunction. These institutions include religious systems, folklore, socialization patterns in the community, and in more modern terms, education system, modern ideologies and political activity, and especially media, various types of media channels. All these shape mentalities and behavior patterns directly. Uh, although the same are also affected or molded by indirectly by the geography of a region, the historical memories of a region, etc. So this is what I mean by culture. Now, obviously, I won't be able to cover the entire spectrum of social structure or of culture, and rather select some, especially under social structure. I would be talking about the changing class relations and hierarchy in Dhantala since 1780 roughly. And in culture, I'll be talking more about the changing political consciousness in the village from late 18th century to early 21st century. Now, before I proceed for discussing these issues, I would also confess my ideological bias, since its subconscious influence on my not only analysis but choice of uh, facts, evidence, etc., cannot be ruled out. I happen to have a liberal bent in contrast to the nationalist or the socialist political leaning. And uh, I must also now clarify why I chose Dhantala for my research work. Actually, this was a fallout of my study of a slum in my neighborhood in Delhi, which had some migrants from this village. As I was completing my MPhil dissertation, I became very curious about rural life and luckily got help from these immigrants into the slum that I was studying. And that's how I landed in Dhantala in 1989. Now, talking about the broader trends in social and cultural histories in India, no doubt we can note real bloom of caste studies, gender studies, life histories, subaltern studies, studies of discourses, etc., which really make the field extremely fascinating for students of history today. Not only has this uh, field blossomed significantly in recent decades, but also the traditional concerns of historians, like, for example, political history, administrative history, or economic history, have been explained with reference increasingly to cultural factors and social structural factors. This is a very notable and rich enhancement of the field. However, on the negative side, there are two tendencies which are often visible, which give some dismay. And this includes one, a lack of long-term comparative synthesis of the field. Instead, we have lots of uh, intensive explorations of specific events or a court case, for example, or someone's letters, etc. Secondly, we unfortunately see a lot of repetition of ideologically correct uh, readings of events. For example, in many gender study papers or subaltern study papers, there's a tendency to repeat the coexistence of, for example, resistance and hegemony in subaltern consciousness, just to give one example. In order to uh, address these problems, obviously, at one level, we need to relate micro studies with other micro studies, which may be the rich secondary literature in the field, and thereby come at some long-term perspectives on change, especially in studied caste, in gender relations, in consciousness, etc., for example. And secondly, we need to, I would say, combine fieldwork along with archival work, especially for the colonial era and contemporary histories, uh, since a lot of local records, kacheri records, private papers, family documents, also the bhats, vanshavalis, and court papers, etc., are easily available. And these can be also combined with interviews, group discussions, elders recall, and even quantitative surveys, etc., in the field. A very important bonus of combining fieldwork with archival work is the uh, sur- surfeit of evidence that we get in altogether new fields. For example, private life. We can build histories of private life, of changing family relations, of mentalities, etc., which are very difficult to build on a long term basis from just archival records. This raises a very important question. Why has fieldwork not been combined, at least for the modern era, by historians uh, to the extent that is possible? Although we have some now historians combining fieldwork with archival work, some of the partition histories stand tall in this field. But the full potential of this combination of fieldwork and archival work has not been done clearly in India. And there are perhaps two reasons for this. One, there is some methodological skepticism about oral histories and oral evidence, etc., which is actually puerile because I said fieldwork also brings us face to face with a lot of new documentary evidence. It is not just oral evidence that we tap. And combining oral evidence with documentary evidence from fieldwork is surely gives us a bonanza of new insights and perspectives. But there is therefore another reason, perhaps, which is actually quite worrisome, why lots of historians of the modern era are not taking recourse to fieldwork. And that seems to be that fieldwork hits hard at ideological presumptions that are unfortunately valued excessively by some scholars. Uh, Hopefully, in future, we will have more work combining these two sources of evidence. Uh, as I said, social and cultural change has a large spectrum, and I am particularly going to focus on changing class relations and changing political consciousness in Dhantala over the past 2.5 centuries. Once, I hope I am very clearly audible.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's begin. Before I go into the social and cultural history of Dhantala, let's begin with understanding the layout and the location of the village. The village, as I said, is situated in Meerut district. It is 80 kilometers east of Delhi and 20 kilometers west of Meerut city. It's spread over about 1,500 acres, of which 1,300 acres are fields, about 100 acres are 3 ponds and temple, etc., the public spaces, and about 100 acres are the residential tolas or blocks, uh, which are segregated by major caste groups of the village. The major segments in the village are the small and middle peasantry, who are mainly Gujars and Jats, but also now the old artisan caste of Kumhar and Muslims who have also taken to agriculture and commercial dairying lately. And then there are Dalits, two subcastes, Valmikis and Jatavs, who are both uh, farm and non-farm laborers, but also some are now uh, taking to the occupations of uh, artisans and service providers, etc. The population of the village when I came here first in 1989 for my first survey was about 2000, and according to the 2011 census of the village, of which I saw the unit level data, the numbers had grown to about 2,700. But in 2014, in my last comprehensive survey, I found the population to be around 2,600, which is a very interesting indicator of the fact that after a very long time, the village population has begun to shrink, largely because of two reasons. One, the falling birth rate and adoption of family planning by many families in the village, but also because of increasing migration to surrounding cities from Ghaziabad, Delhi, Meerut, etc. Now, the Vanshavali records maintained by the Bhats of the village show that till about 1780, the land was apparently uncultivated, although it's a very fertile land and has three ponds, as I said. And the first settlers were actually uh, some Gurjar herdsmen who had come from Ghaziabad. Later on, more Gurjar families settled in, and they were encouraged by the Zamidar of Todi, under whom this uncultivated land lay. They encouraged these settlers to take to cultivation along with cattle rearing, and that's how the village started growing. And as we all know, in 1803, the British, after defeating the Marathas at Surji Arjan Gaon, they took over this region and started the Mahalwadi settlement. And we see that the village became stable uh, from then on. Now, this raises a very interesting question. Given the fertility of this Doab tract, why was it uncultivated for such before 1780? And the villagers have some elders have an account for this. They say that during the 17th century, this was actually a prosperous village, but it was destroyed by the Delhi armies, and the villagers had apparently fled the tract at that time. And it is only after 1780 that we see herdsmen, as I said, settling down and starting the village. I must mention that this village was earlier called Rasulpur Dhantala, after Sian of the Zamindar family called Rasul Baksh, whose grave is still there in the village. And he was particularly investing in the cultivation, growth of agriculture and cultivation in this tract. Uh, this also throws, forces us to actually develop a fresh perspective on the impact of colonial rule on India. Often we, of course, remember the colonial rule for deindustrialization and destruction of our crafts, of also heavy taxation and repressive land revenue settlements, etc. But the fact that a village like Dhantala in a very fertile tract became stable only after the coming of the British reminds us that this region was experiencing a lot of constant warfare and also, of course, attacks by the Western invaders. And it is the British rule that ended this streak of violence. And uh, also, from early 20th century, we see continuous growth in our population, both in India, and the same is reflected in the demographic record of Dhantala also. I could track the uh, population score in the Kacheri records for 1930, when it was mentioned as about 700. And obviously, the village has been growing continuously since then. And this is another thing which needs to be credited to the colonial administration, because the secular growth in population of the country is obviously unprecedented. India had never grown on a continuous basis before 20th century, and the obviously the role of railways in uh, uh, moving food grains across regions, the development of district hospitals, some modern medicine, etc., played a role in this significant improvement in life expectancy in the country, which, according to census records, rose from about 25 years to 33 years by 1947. Today, of course, we know the life expectancy average in the country is about 67 years. Now, let's have a brief look at the growth of amenities and infrastructure in Dhantala over the 2 centuries that we are discussing. Under the colonial rule, apart from the decline in death rate, another important development was the building of Gang Nehar, which comes close, though not exactly, it doesn't touch Dhantala. And this is again a very important development for the region. Also, the British introduced the first tenancy protection laws. Even our greatest monarchs like Ashoka and Akbar are not known for having introduced any security measures for Dalits or rural tenants, etc. Apart from some rent relief during famines and so on. This is another positive side of the British rule. Yet, on the whole, in 1947, Dhantala had neither any school, nor electricity, nor dispensary, nor any pakka road. And despite some improvement in death rate, the mortality was still very high. And there were one electric tube well had been installed in the village in 1935. This is the first electric tube well. And some brick wells had also been constructed, replacing the kacha rahets that were the mainstay of irrigation in earlier times. The first decade after independence saw a slew of major changes. Apart from introduction of universal franchise, we had abolition of zamindari, also introduction of land ceilings. In this region, the ceiling for individual holding is fixed at 18 acres for one holder. Also, the major reduction in tax, although reduction in tax had started under the Britishers themselves, this is another point which is often overlooked. And in fact, I saw for the rent and tax receipts of 1947 with one of the families of the village, and they suggest that about 15% of the gross produce was given as tax, which is obviously a big slide from Akbar's, for example, 33% demand over the gross produce. The first decade after independence also saw the construction of the first primary school, the installation of hand pumps. The first bicycle came to the village, and also the first radio, which was a very popular medium for catching up with news as well as songs in those times, and which it used to be used collectively by villagers. In 1960s, Nehru's major effort to establish block development offices, and for Dhantala, the block development office is at Kharkhoda, which is a small town at about 3 kilometers away from the village. The first Pakka road was built in 1960s on the outskirts of the village, and also the Pradhan, elected Pradhan rather than a nominated one, was also development of the 1960s. Also, the one major change was the arrival of HYVs, or high yielding variety of seeds, both wheat and rice. Sonhera Chausat is the wheat variety, which is still remembered by the village because immediately the yields almost doubled after the coming of these seeds. In 1970s, the Green Revolution took off, and this led to further installation of tube wells, the use of fertilizers. Power supply also arrived in homes for the first time now, and this of course enabled villagers to start using fans and bulbs and so on. The first tractor came to the village in 1970s, and also the 20-point program of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had one element called ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Scheme, which brought the appointment of ashas, or village nurses, and gave a big fillip to the vaccination program, thereby reducing infant mortality, especially, in a major way. In 1980s, the White Revolution took off, and milk cooperative was established in the village, adding substantially to the agriculturist income. And also the first television sets came during this time, and villagers recall that the Ramayana serial was particularly a major reason for the purchase of first TV sets by the better off families in the village. And of course, programs were viewed collectively in those days. In 1984, a very important event happened in the village when all the landless they demonstrated at the Meerut Collectorate and demanded that the 200 odd acres, which was the common land of the village, which was used for grazing, etc., should be distributed among all the landless. And this, after a long struggle for several months, in which the Communist Party unit of Meerut city, especially a leader called Satpal, played a very important role, and the movement succeeded. In 1990s, two major developments took place, one in the economic field and the other in the political field. The liberalization of the economy, or rather the partial liberalization, which was introduced by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, actually was expected to lead to greater poverty, especially by left economists. But quite the contrary seems to have happened, and there was a visible decline in poverty in 1990s for the first time. This was reflected in increasing construction of pakka houses instead of kacha houses, and also visibility of two-wheelers, etc., even in Dalit homes, which started during this period. What was the reason? Actually, liberalization helped in reduction of poverty by encouraging migration of landless workers from villages to cities. This in turn was encouraged by the expanding middle class in places like Gurgaon, Noida, etc., which liberalization spawned. And this middle class demanded services from villagers. And this in turn helped the rural farm wage to go up significantly. Today, the wage in Dhantala is about 400 rupees for unskilled worker. In 1989, I had noted the wage was rupees 20 per day. If we look at the inflation over the same period, we note more than doubling of the real wage over this time span. In